Okay, so you're interested in what's happening with China's economy. We've got a deep dive for you today.
Uh-huh.
It's based on this article called China's Economic Stimulus. Why? It's failing.
Okay.
Get this. They've been trying to boost their economy with these massive stimulus packages,
Right.
but it doesn't seem to be working as well as they hoped.
Hmm.
It's kind of like trying to jumpstart a car with a dead battery, you know?
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Well, what's really interesting here is that China's actually launched multiple stimulus packages.
Oh, wow.
Think about it. They've tried this playbook before, so why aren't things taking off the way they expected?
Right.
The article even uses this analogy.
Okay.
Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
Yeah, and I bet investors are starting to feel a little like that second fool, right?
For sure.
I mean, they're pouring money into the economy, but it doesn't seem to be having the desired effect.
Yeah.
It begs the question, is quantitative easing,
Uh-huh.
or QE, as it's often called,
Right.
really the magic bullet everyone thinks it is?
That's the big question this article digs into.
Okay.
You see, the idea behind QE is that by injecting money into the economy,
Mm-hmm.
typically by buying bonds, you can lower interest rates and encourage borrowing and spending.
Okay.
It's almost like printing money,
Right.
hoping to boost the economy.
Yeah.
But it's not as simple as it sounds.
Right.
It can lead to inflation,
Uh-huh.
which we've seen happening in other parts of the world.
Oh, for sure.
What we're seeing in China really challenges this assumption that QE is a guaranteed path to recovery.
Okay, so maybe QE isn't the quick fix it's often touted to be.
Yeah.
But what about other factors?
Mm.
I mean, is it possible that there are other things at play here that are making China's stimulus efforts less effective this time around?
Absolutely.
Hmm.
The article highlights what the author calls cognitive dissonance in economics.
Cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, think of it this way.
Okay.
If you really believe something and it turns out to be wrong, it can be hard to admit you were mistaken.
Yeah.
It's the same with economic policies. Governments and central banks can become so attached to a particular model
Right.
that they're reluctant to admit it might be flawed, even when the evidence is staring them in the face.
So you're saying there's a bit of denial going on?
Kind of, yeah.
Like they're clinging to these policies even though they might not be working as intended?
Exactly.
Look, come on, don't economists and policymakers look at the data?
They do. But data can be interpreted in different ways.
Mhm.
The article gives the example of the U.S. struggling for years to hit a 2% inflation target.
Right.
And then, boom, when stimulus was used for other purposes, we saw inflation skyrocket.
Oh, wow.
So it raises the question, do we really understand how these actions will play out in the long run?
Yeah.
Are we just kicking the can down the road and creating bigger problems for ourselves later on?
Okay, so maybe there's some disconnect between theory and reality.
For sure.
But let's get back to China.
What?
What specific signs are they seeing that suggest things aren't going as planned? I mean, what's the data telling us?
One key indicator is their Purchasing Managers Index, or PMI.
Okay.
This is a measure of the health of the manufacturing sector.
Mm-hmm.
And in China, it's been declining.
Oh, no.
This suggests that manufacturing activity is slowing down, even with all this stimulus money being pumped in.
So it's like they're trying to jumpstart that car, but the engine keeps sputtering.
Exactly.
That's not a good sign. So if stimulus isn't the answer, what is?
Right.
The article seems to suggest that government spending,
Yeah.
while intended to help, can actually backfire.
Yeah.
How so?
The argument is that government spending can distort the natural flow of the economy.
Okay.
It might create artificial booms in certain sectors, but those booms aren't necessarily sustainable.
I see.
And when they inevitably fade, the economy could be in even worse shape than before.
That's interesting. So it's not just about throwing money at a problem. It's about understanding how that money will impact the system as a whole, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the author points out this almost ironic situation where economists keep recommending more stimulus, even though it hasn't always worked in the past.
Really?
It's a bit like a doctor prescribing the same medicine, even though the patient isn't getting better. You have to wonder if there's a point where you need to reevaluate the diagnosis and consider a different treatment.
Oh, okay. So maybe we need to be a bit more skeptical of this more stimulus mantra.
I think so.
And while we're on the topic of skepticism, the article also raises some doubts about the accuracy of China's economic data.
Uh-oh.
That's a bit unsettling, isn't it?
It is? They're openly admitting to some struggles.
Right.
But the article suggests that they might be downplaying the true extent of their economic slowdown.
Oh, wow.
Which begs the question, if things are bad enough for them to admit there's a problem,
Yeah.
how bad are things really?
Now, that's a thought-provoking question.
Yeah.
So we've got stimulus fatigue, data skepticism, and a sputtering economy. And on top of all that, there's the looming possibility of trade wars, especially with talks of a potential Trump administration in the future. Remember, the article was written before 2025, so we're looking at this from a historical perspective.
Right.
But I'm curious, what did they say about tariffs and how they might play into this whole situation?
Well, they acknowledge that tariffs can raise prices for consumers, which obviously isn't ideal.
Right.
But they also make the point that tariffs can be a strategic tool in trade negotiations.
So kind of a double-edged sword.
Yeah,
Hurtful in some ways, but potentially useful in others.
exactly. They suggest that tariffs could be used as leverage in trade talks, especially if China's economy is already in a vulnerable position.
All right, so we've got a lot to unpack here. Stimulus, data, skepticism, trade tensions, and a potentially vulnerable economy.
Lots to think about.
What ties all this together, according to the article, is a fundamental flaw in China's approach.
Oh,
Their reliance on central planning.
interesting.
This is where the author really digs in. They argue that trying to centrally plan an economy out of trouble is inherently flawed. It creates too much bureaucracy,
Right.
stifles innovation, and prevents the market from correcting itself naturally.
I see.
So less government control, more free market.
Basically.
That's a pretty bold statement, wouldn't you say?
It is, and it's a point of contention even today.
Yeah, I bet.
But the author argues that reducing regulations and embracing free market principles would be a much more effective way for China to achieve sustainable growth.
Wow.
And this brings us to another fascinating aspect of the article,
Okay.
the myth of reserve requirements.
Yeah, I'm going to admit I need a quick refresher on that one.
Okay, sure.
Can you remind us what reserve requirements are and why they matter in this discussion?
Sure. Reserve requirements refer to the amount of money that banks are required to hold in reserve rather than lending it out.
Okay.
You see, lowering these requirements is often seen as a way to stimulate the economy. The idea is that if banks have more money available to lend, they'll lend more, and that will boost economic activity.
So it's like loosening the reins on the banks a little bit, hoping they'll spur some growth.
Right, but the article debunks this as a myth.
Really?
They point out that banks don't just lend money because they have it available. They lend based on risk and reward calculations.
Well, you see.
If they see economic uncertainty on the horizon, like deflation, they're less likely to lend aggressively, even if they have more reserves.
So it's not just about having the money, it's about having the confidence to lend it.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
And this all ties back to the author's main argument,
Okay.
that massive government intervention, often done with the best of intentions, can actually create more problems than it solves. It's a cautionary tale for any government that thinks it can control an economy with a heavy hand.
Right, because economies are complex.
They are.
They're dynamic, they're unpredictable,
Yeah.
and sometimes trying to overmanage them can do more harm than good.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that there's no quick fix, no magic bullet when it comes to economic challenges.
Right.
Real solutions require a deeper understanding of the forces at play and a willingness to adapt to ever-changing circumstances.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
We have.
We've explored the limitations of stimulus, the complexities of economic data,
Right.
the potential impact of trade wars,
Yeah.
and the inherent challenges of central planning.
For sure.
I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on all of this.
Well, it's certainly a lot to process, and it raises some fundamental questions about how we approach economic policy in a world that seems increasingly interconnected and uncertain.
Definitely. But before we dive into those bigger questions, let's take a step back and consider the human element in all of this.
Okay.
What do these economic trends mean for people on the ground? How are real lives being impacted by these policies and decisions?
That's a great point. It's easy to get caught up in the abstract concepts of economics. But at the end of the day, it's about real people trying to make a living, provide for their families, and build a better future.
Yeah, for sure.
And the article touches on this, especially when discussing stimulus checks.
Oh, yeah.
Remember those?
Yeah.
They felt good in the moment, right? A little boost to help us through tough times.
Right.
But what were the long-term consequences?
Hmm.
Did they really address the underlying issues, or did they just create a temporary illusion of prosperity?
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
You might cover up the problem for a while, but it doesn't actually fix anything.
Right.
And speaking of long-term consequences, this whole discussion about China's economic struggles, their reliance on stimulus and potential pitfalls of central planning, It's got me thinking.
Yeah.
What are the key takeaways here? What can we learn from this situation, not just about China, but about how we think about economic policy in general?
Well, one of the biggest takeaways for me is that economic policy is rarely black and white.
Yeah.
There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Okay.
What works in one country at one particular time might be disastrous in another.
So it's not as simple as saying stimulus is always good or always bad.
Nope.
It's more nuanced than that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the specific context, weighing the potential benefits against the risks, and being prepared to adapt as circumstances change.
Okay.
And frankly, being honest about what isn't working.
And maybe being a little more skeptical of those who claim to have all the answers.
I think that's a healthy approach, especially in today's world where things are changing so rapidly.
Speaking of skepticism, this whole conversation about data manipulation, I mean, it's kind of unsettling, right?
It is.
It makes you wonder how much of what we hear, what we read is actually true.
It's a valid concern.
Yeah.
We live in an age of information overload, and it can be difficult to separate fact from fiction.
Yeah, for sure.
That's why it's so important to be critical thinkers,
Mm-hmm.
to question our assumptions, and to seek out multiple perspectives.
Don't just take things at face value, right? Do your own research, connect the dots, and form your own conclusions.
Exactly. And be wary of anyone who claims to have a monopoly on the truth.
Right.
There's always more to learn, always different angles to consider.
So how does all of this relate to you, the listener?
Right.
Why should you care about China's stimulus struggles, about economic data, about central planning? I mean,
Yeah.
it all seems a bit distant and abstract, right?
Yeah. Well, on one level, it's about understanding the world around us.
Okay,
China is a major player in the global economy.
for sure.
And what happens there has ripple effects that can be felt all over the world.
Right.
Their economic health impacts trade, investment, and even the prices we pay for goods and services here at home.
So even if you're not directly invested in the Chinese market, you're still part of this interconnected global system, right?
Right.
What happens there can impact your life in very real ways.
Absolutely. But beyond that, I think there are some broader lessons to be learned from China's experience. Lessons that apply to all of us, regardless of where we live or what we do.
Like what?
For example, the article highlights the potential dangers of government overreach.
Okay.
It's a reminder that even well-intentioned policies can have unintended consequences.
Right.
And that sometimes the best solution is to step back and let market forces play out.
It's about finding that balance between intervention and letting things run their course right.
Exactly.
But that can be a tough call to make, especially when there are so many different interests and opinions at play.
It is. And this brings up another important point.
What's that?
The debate between government intervention and free markets.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
It's a debate that's been going on for centuries, and there's no easy answer.
Yeah, it's complex. Some argue that government intervention is essential to ensure fairness, stability, and social welfare. They point to the potential for market failures like monopolies and externalities that can harm consumers and the environment.
Right. On the other hand, proponents of free markets argue that government intervention often stifles innovation, creates inefficiencies, and distorts the natural allocation of resources. They believe that individuals and businesses acting in their own self-interest are better equipped to make economic decisions than government bureaucrats.
So it's a tug of war between those who believe in a more hands-on approach and those who advocate for a more laissez-faire system.
And where you fall on that spectrum often depends on your values, your beliefs about the role of government, and your understanding of how economies work.
Right, because there's no one right answer. It's about finding the approach that best aligns with your vision of a just and prosperous society.
And that's a conversation that's worth having.
I agree.
It's a conversation that requires us to engage with different perspectives, to weigh the evidence, and to think critically about the choices we make, both individually and collectively.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into China's stimulus struggles, we're left with more questions than answers.
We are.
But that's not necessarily a bad thing, right?
Not at all. Questions can be more valuable than answers sometimes.
Oh, so?
They push us to think deeper, to challenge our assumptions, and to continue learning and evolving our understanding of the world.
I think that's a great point to end on. This deep dive has given you a lot to consider, and we hope it sparks some further exploration on your part. Because at the end of the day, we're all trying to navigate this complex world and make sense of the forces that shape our lives.
That's a great way to put it. It's about understanding that we're not just passive observers. We have a role to play in shaping the future, both through the choices we make as individuals and the policies we support as citizens.
And that starts with being informed, engaged, and willing to challenge the status quo.
Absolutely. Now, after all this talk about stimulus government intervention and the complexities of economic policy, I'm curious,
What is it?
what stands out to you from this deep dive? What are your thoughts on how we should approach these economic challenges in a world that seems increasingly complex and interconnected?
Well, we don't expect you to have all the answers, but we hope this conversation has given you some food for thought
Right.
and maybe even inspired you to explore these issues further on your own.
Because informed citizens are the foundation of a healthy economy and a vibrant democracy.
So keep asking questions, keep challenging assumptions,
Mhm.
and keep learning.
That's the best way to navigate the complexities of the economic world.
And hey, maybe you'll even come up with some solutions that the experts haven't thought of yet.
And now, wouldn't that be something?
Until next time, keep diving deep.